Good morning, beautiful people. Welcome to another episode of Kiko's Freethinkers Forum. Well, good afternoon if you're in the UK, my comrades over there. We're joined by a repeat guest, Radhika Desai. This is episode 88, and we're looking forward to talking to Dr. Desai again. We had a wonderful conversation in episode 74. I recommend my audience to go back and watch the episode 74 on Kiko's Freethinkers Forum YouTube channel. Subscribe for free. Just a little bit of your time to expand your mind. And remember, you can't unthink free thought. Um, we're going to talk to Dr. Desai, who's a professor at the University of Manitoba. She's currently a visiting professor at the London School of Economics. And we discussed her book, the last episode 74, entitled Capitalism, Coronavirus, and War, a Geopolitical Economy. We talked so much about some theory, socialism, capitalism, just for my audience that's a little bit more curious and is newly introduced to these topics that can be very complex. But I think Dr. Desai explained very well what her intentions were in the book. But we're going to continue to discuss chapters 4 and 5 in particular and some of the conclusion of that aforementioned book. But I want to just say welcome to the show again, and thanks for coming back on.
Thanks for having me, Kiko. I really enjoyed our last discussion, and I'm looking forward to this one.
Absolutely. And shout out to a comrade that's probably the most popular follower on the forum who's been on themselves quite a few times. Jay Carrico was the initial point of interest that Jay told me, you got to get Radhika Desai on your show. And I was like, okay, I think I've heard of Radhika Desai before, just based on other, friends and just different links and sources that I have. And so I reached out to Radhika, and she graciously accepted the invitation for episode 74. And I know this one's going to be just as great. We have a lot to cover today. So let's get started with that. And my first question, I guess, would be this whole idea of neoliberalism is such a word that people use a lot, for different reasons. You hear it a lot when we describe these so-called austerity policies, and we talk about the two-party system in the United States, especially, and this word neoliberalism comes up a lot. We had Dr. Jack Rasmus on the show 4 different times, and he had a book published in 2019. It's entitled "The Scourge of Neoliberalism: U.S. Economic Policy under from Reagan to Trump." And he's actually working on a new edition of that book, expanding on the topic. You talk about neoliberalism a lot in chapter 4. What exactly are you referring to when you talk about neoliberalism? Is this strictly from the gold standard once we got off of it until where we see ourselves now?
Well, there's many, talking about neoliberalism has to be a little bit like, peeling the layers of an onion. And a bit like an onion, of course, there is actually no core to neoliberalism. So make sure I come back to that point at the very end. But let me begin by peeling the most uppermost layers. So obviously, neoliberalism is the name that we give to the set of policies justified in the name of free markets and competition and so on that have been applied in the Western countries, but also the world over. In fact, you will remember that this past we marked the 50th anniversary of the coup against Allende, and which was made by General Augusto Pinochet, who then ruled Chile for the next several decades. And under Pinochet, Chile became the first victims, let's say, put it that way, of neoliberalism back in the early 70s. But by the end of the 1970s, with the election of governments like Thatcher's and Reagan's in the UK and the US, you had governments installed in power who were committed to this paradigm. So broadly speaking, it's essentially the rhetoric of free markets and free trade, under which we have had a whole range of policies that have been very harmful to the popular interest. So let's just rattle off some of the main ones. So first of all, and this involved the reversal, of course, of many of the policies that were applied in the name of the Keynesian welfare state. So it is in many ways the sort of mirror opposite of the Keynesian welfare state. What do we mean by that? So number one, the commitment that used to exist under the Keynesian welfare state in the post-war period to full employment was reversed. The governments and central banks were no longer to aim for full employment, but rather at low inflation. And there again, you could do a whole show about inflation and unemployment, and how the policy of low inflation benefits rich people, while the policy of low unemployment benefits working people. But that's the first thing. Secondly, there was a rollback of social services and all forms of social spending. Thirdly, there was privatization. Fourthly, there was a commitment, there was a withdrawal from the commitment to progressive taxation, that is a taxation system in which richer people pay a higher proportion of their income in taxes because they can afford to, and poor people pay a lower proportion. This has increasingly been turned back because these tax cuts for rich people, essentially, this is what it amounts to, have been justified by saying that if you give tax cuts to rich people and allow them to keep their money, they will invest it, but they, of course, have not invested it. The neoliberal period has been accompanied by the lowest rates of both investment and growth compared to the golden age period or the Keynesian welfare state period. So there is that. There is also, in addition to privatization, that's contracting out of social services. So the governments may not privatize many of the things they were doing, but what they do instead is they privatize it piecemeal. So if you're running a public hospital, say the administration will be given over to a private corporation, the laundry and the food preparation will be given over to a private corporation instead of being done in-house by unionized, well-paid labor, etc., etc. So that's called the contracting out of social services. So this is the whole slew of policies. And of course, under this, essentially, we have seen ordinary working people in most countries essentially suffering from essentially stagnant wages or barely rising wages, even while productivity is going up. We have seen a growth slowing down because, the fact is that neoliberalism was supposed to be a response to the crisis of the 1970s. And we've discussed this, I think, in the previous episode, where, the Western world stood at a forks in the road. They could have taken a left direction and they would have said, let's deepen the socialistic reforms of the post-Second World War period because they were good, and deepening them will be better and it will resolve the crisis. But no, we took the other way, which was what the neoliberals essentially, and we'll come back to who they were in a minute, were recommending, which is that, roll back the provisions of the Keynesian welfare state. They shackle private enterprise, and the dead hand of the state is weighing on private enterprise. And if you remove it, then you will have, capital will recover, private enterprise will recover its dynamism, and we will have a wonderful, prosperous economy. That prediction was still 40 plus years on. We are still waiting for that to happen. It's not happening. So in short, if you were to answer, just at the most superficial but true level, what is neoliberalism, you would say that is neoliberalism. But we can go further, deeper down into it if you want as well.
Yes, I had a curious question because I don't think I asked you this the first time we discussed. What is your background in economics as it pertains? Do you subscribe to a particular type of economic theory, or are you more of a mixed bag when it comes to like where your theoretical basis is when you analyze economics?
That's another huge question. But again, let me try to give you a very brief answer. So if I were, if you were to ask me to describe what sort of economist I am, I would be. I would say I'm a Marxist who also thinks, however, that a lot of what passes for Marxist economics is actually wrong. So that the way I approach my understanding of the economy, I go back to the original writings of Marx, uncontaminated by essentially neoclassical economics, which has also very much to do with neoliberalism. So I go back to, and I recover that understanding of Marx. And when I do that, what I find is that there are all the precursors of Marx, which, whether it's Adam Smith or Ricardo, they were not 100% right. And Marx was very substantially right, but he also left an incomplete corpus of work. But nevertheless, you find a great deal to learn from them. You find an enormous amount to learn from Marx. who analyzed capitalism as contradictory value production, all three words being very important. And then after Marx, because Marx was so bowdlerized, what you have as a consequence is a lot of people misunderstanding Marx, rejecting him, and often reinventing the wheel because they have rejected Marx. So as a consequence, there are other thinkers, later thinkers. I can think of John Maynard Keynes, Karl Polanyi, Thorstein Veblen, many others who, no matter what their specific attitude towards Marx, ended up coming quite close to many of the things he was saying. So I don't reject their views either. And a final school I will mention is the school which is generally known in our time as the school of developmental state theorists. So they emphasize the essential role of the state in development because, and this is very compatible with Marx for a very simple reason. The first is that well, for one very simple reason, I can name others, but let me just name the simplest one. For Marx, capitalism was inherently contradictory. Capitalism aimed at producing value rather than producing, shirts or cars or beds or washing machines, things that we need. We produce value instead, and it is an inherently contradictory enterprise. And as a consequence, a society that becomes oriented to value production suffers from all the contradictions of capitalism, and it cannot survive unless the state steps in right from the beginning and on a repeated and regular basis restabilizes society that is constantly destabilized by the contradictions of capitalism. The state is always very critically important. So for all these, so that's the kind of economist. So I'm basically a Marxist well, I would say I follow Marx's critical political economy, which is why I call what I study or what I have proposed to understand these matters at a world level geopolitical economy, because it is political economy but transposed to the international level. But you can't separate the politics and the economics. And one of the big problems is what happened very soon after Marx passed away, basically, is that neoclassical economics emerged, and neoliberalism is based in neoclassical economics. So neoclassical economics emerged in the late 1870s, and it was opposed to Marxism, and it became even more so as time went on. But a lot of Marxists, instead of fighting this frontally as they should have, decided to try to reconcile the two. It's impossible. The two are mutually incomprehensible. And in this vain attempt to fit Marxism into neoclassical economics is what has produced Marxist economics. And so what every solution that they try to reconcile the two doesn't work. But because it doesn't work, the project is never completed, and people keep trying again and again new and different solutions and so on. So I don't accept much of what passes for Marxist economics, which is not to say that these people are bad people. I would be on the same demonstrations with them, 90% of the same demonstrations with them. So this is not, but they do fundamentally misunderstand certain things that I think are critically important for us to understand, especially today when capitalism is in its knockdown crisis.
Thank you so much for the explanation. That opens up a couple of more questions because we've had Austrian economist Mike Termont. He's actually a libertarian candidate run for president. And it sounds like what Mike was describing is diametrically opposed to what you were saying. And when you refer to the 1870s, I'm assuming that you're talking about neoclassic people like von Mises and the Hayeks of the world. I was dialoguing with him, and it was a great dialogue, but he obviously knew that I came from a different perspective. I'm not an economist, but I would identify as someone on the left, but not the US left. I would probably be considered far left of people in the United States, just because there's just so many contradictory elements to the US left as it is, that hold on so tightly to capitalism while at the same time claiming to be a leftist. Whatever. To me, in the United States, left has been so watered down and just it's almost comical. at times. Just and if people go back and watch episodes, they know exactly what I mean about the comical nature of the U.S. left, which is inherently very pro-capitalism, pro-market, and everything else. I mean, it's just and it's tied into our political system. And I love the comment you just made there, where you can't discount the economics and the politics; they go together. And I don't think a lot of the U.S. comrades understand how the economic policy and this political economy that we have, you can't really separate the two. And the whole loss of international consciousness, there's no awareness of international consciousness with the U.S. left. I don't think there is anyway to kind of complete the puzzle. And I think if they considered that, they would be more nuanced. At the very least, they'd be a more nuanced left. I don't know if they would be any more effective at being a leftist, but there's just a
Well,
lot that you said there.
yeah, no, I would just say that quite frankly, yeah, I do me so when I refer to the 1870s, I'm referring to the marginalist revolution, which gave rise to neoclassical economics. Now, like I said, from very early on, people started being trained in this kind of economics, and then after being trained in that, coming to Marxism. But because they could never, because these two methodologies are so completely different, that these people who are trained in neoclassical economics simply could not understand what Marx meant by elementary things like value, like contradiction, and such like things. And so they were bound to misunderstand Marx. And then they tried to, like I say, fit the one into the other. And the other thing you should know about neoclassical economics is that it had two or three different wings. So, it had let's say it had two wings. One was the equilibrium or Walrasian wing, and the other was the Austrian or non-equilibrium wing. In many ways, the Walrasian wing was susceptible to even some kind of left-wing manifestations, because they at least posited an ideal of a well-functioning society in equilibrium, and that ideal, of course, was could be potentially critical of the reality of capitalism, which was very far from it. So in that sense, it gave rise to welfare economics. It gave rise to even certain types of socialist economics, in the sense that there was the whole socialist calculation debate and all those sorts of things. But then there was a neo-Austrian economics, which says it doesn't matter if there is no equilibrium. In fact, there is no equilibrium. We shouldn't look for it. But still, what you will get when you have a system of private enterprise, essentially capitalism, is the best you can expect. So even if it's not very good, that's the best you can expect. And that is actually, in many ways, because it puts less of a burden on capitalism, it is a more dogged defense of capitalism than the other one, right? So the Austrians are very, very dogged. And the funny thing about that is, and I'll just say one thing, because earlier I was referring to the peeling of layers, right? Neoclassical economics emerges circa 1870, and it really begins to develop over the next several decades. These are the same decades during which capitalism in the countries where it first arose is entering the monopoly stage. It is leaving the competitive stage and entering the monopoly stage. Now, all the justifications that neoclassical economics has of capitalism are based on competition, are based on, and what all the wonderful things. But competition has essentially run its course. Competition through its operation has produced monopoly. Now you are going to have monopoly capitalism. And Marx had said very clearly that once you get monopoly capitalism, everybody will see that capitalism is past its sell-by date, that now it has brought us this far, it has developed the forces of production to some extent, even though it has done it chaotically and brutally. But okay, fine. But now it's time to, it has produced these vast masses of capital, in which the labor of hundreds of thousands of people is involved in order to produce. And it's very clear that this is not the work of any one person. It is the work of the whole of society, and it's time to socialize it. And as Marx thought everybody would see that. And in some ways, neoclassical economics should be seen as an attempt to try to prevent people from coming to this conclusion. Because what it has done is it has defended monopoly in the name of free markets and competition. But we don't have free markets. We have monopoly markets. We don't have competition. We have monopolies, etc. And monopoly is already the phase in which capitalism loses its dynamism. It ceases to be dynamic productively. So that's why, so anyway, it's a long story, but I will simply say that that's another thing you have to know about neoliberalism and the neoclassical economics on which it rests, is that it is in the business of justifying monopoly in the name of free markets and competition.
That's very interesting. That word I haven't heard a lot used, but you definitely use it in the book, and it's not a word that I've heard a lot. Just we've had quite a few economic discussions on the forum, and that's a word that I don't know if it's intentionally not mentioned, but that's an interesting way to look at it. I'll definitely, because yeah, thinking about when I hear that association, it's almost like something that the neoclassic people are conscious of. And so there's a reason why they emphasize, you hear free enterprise, free market all the time, but you never hear monopoly, because
Exactly.
it's an acknowledgement of that there's a blind spot. They can't say that
Exactly.
because that would break down the whole argument.
Precisely.
That's interesting. I do have one more question before we go back to neoliberalism, and that's this whole idea of, you said that you like to go back to Marx himself. Um, how are you able to do that, considering that we're talking about the historicity of Marx in the 1850s? We're talking about, how do we go back to a context back then, and you're operating in completely different economic times? Like, how do you stay true to Marx without losing sight of Marx?
That's a really interesting and important question. So first of all, let me say that capitalism cannot be understood in a series of photographs. It has to be understood as a film. So that film started when Marx was writing. So and what Marx said about the capitalism that he observed was very important in itself. That is to say, he was observing the capitalism up to the late 19th century, and he was witness to that. He passed away in 1883. So, he was around until then. And he could also already see at the time he was writing that the monopoly phase was going to, and was in fact, the competitive phase was going to end in a new monopoly phase. And he could already foresee the consequences of that. And so so in that sense, and Marx, Marx was nothing if he was not a prescient writer. And why was he prescient? Because he could think dialectically, because he thought not in terms of statics, but of dynamics. He thought not in terms of, like I said, like a photograph at one period in time, but what happens, he thought of change. So, somebody would say, how can you look at an acorn and think that it's going to grow into an oak? Well, if you know what acorns are, then you know that it's going to grow into an oak, even though the oak and the acorn could not be more different from one another. But you know what's inside that. So Marx saw capitalism developing from its, not exactly from its earliest times, but let's say when it was getting into its stride. And he sat on top of a whole tradition, which is the tradition of classical political economy of Adam Smith, Ricardo, and others. And if there's one way that would be perhaps most appropriate of describing what classical political economy was, you would say that it was an attempt to try to understand the new type of society that was emerging around them. Everybody knew this was qualitatively different. Well, all the thinking people knew, the people in the political economy tradition knew. And the bulk of their effort was trying to understand how this was different from what had gone before, and what were its own dynamics, what were its laws of motion. And Marx was already sitting on the shoulders of other giants when he did his own work. So he benefited from that. And because he was, like I said, he could think dialectically, he had been trained in Hegelian thinking, which of course, goes back to the Greeks, but nevertheless, this ability to think dialectically, to think about change, to think about how intention and effect are not always the same thing. All of these things are combined, and therefore you think historically, because to think dialectically is also to think historically. So in all of that's what makes Marx so good. And we are fortunate that even though Marx did not finish his work, he was witness to the dynamics of capitalism and said enough in his work that we can reconstruct what else he said. So for example, and I'll end with this point, Marx was, when you look at his plan for Capital, he meant to write a 8 to 10 volume work, of which he only completed one in his own lifetime. And then Engels edited 2 further volumes, which were published posthumously. And one of those volumes was going to be about world trade and essentially the interactions of capitalist countries at the world level. Now, Marx never finished that, but he said enough in Capital, in all his other writings about capitalism, never completed that. So this is where I'll start. Okay, so Marx never completed that volume on world trade, but he said enough in all the other things he had written in his various writings about capitalism, in his various other writings. He wrote journalistically, he wrote about, various pre-capitalist forms of production, etc. He wrote enough to leave us with the elements with which we can try to reconstruct what he would have said. And that's what's geopolitical economy for me. It's a reconstruction based on the work of Marx and also reinforced by later writers such as Keynes or the developmental state theorists, or for that matter, Polanyi. So yeah, I would say that that's why I think that Marx is relevant, because Marx knew enough about, let's say, trees and their seeds, that he could tell what kind of seed capitalism was sowing and what kind of tree it would become.
That's a lot of hindsight and foresight.
Yeah.
And it's really amazing. I don't think that Marx he doesn't get the credit that he deserves. And even when I was talking to an Austrian economist about this, he was saying how I guess you would agree with him on this. He was talking about how Marx is misinterpreted, but I don't know
Yes.
exactly. I don't know which direction he was going with that when he made that comment that Marx is
I would love to know, actually.
But it's like when you're talking with different, political ideologies, I just think that any sort of I won't say admission, but any sort of comment that can be thrown into the middle ground is a good thing, because
Yes.
at least it creates a discourse, because you already know where the person's coming from. If they're an Austrian economist, it's pretty clear what side of the fence they're on. But I think it's interesting when you do get those comments, to where it's like, okay, what is that about? And that's the cool thing about discussing with people and different backgrounds, ideologies. That's the whole point of the forum, is to take things away. If you can plant any sort of seed, I won't even call it opposition, but if you can plant any sort of doubt, I guess, to make
I
someone
mean, I
think
think that
about it.
Austrians and Marxists, well, Marxists of my sort anyway, would agree, for example, that capitalism does not lead to equilibrium.
Mm.
I mean, this then for Marxists means that it is it's a perpetually unstable society. And Marxists would say that eventually it comes to the point where this instability performs no function other than a destructive function. Whereas for Austrians, they think that, especially if you're a Schumpeterian, they think that, okay, capitalism may be prone to crisis, but it is also capable of entirely, like, of self-regeneration. So it it still does not need the interfering hand of the state to set things right. But of course, this has not ever been the case. The state has always intervened, and capitalist states have historically intervened to save capitalism from its own problems,
Oh,
and not
wow.
ordinary working people. Yeah.
Oh gosh, well, I was thinking about Dr. Rasmus's book, especially. I mean, I believe both of your books complement each other so well, because he tended to emphasize more the crash of 08, 09, and you're emphasizing the pandemic. You're emphasizing there's a lot of overlap between the two books. Really interesting stuff. And I tell my audience, you can never learn too much, So
True.
please, I'm going to link Dr. Desai's book, Dr. Rasmus's book. It's in all the episode descriptions if you follow the forum. I try to do that to the guests on the show to give us information, give us knowledge, but they also have information, and we need to support their work as well. And so I encourage people to buy Dr. Desai's books, the whole catalog.
And
I
I
want,
should just say, you can, of course, you can buy all of them. That would be great. But the latest one that we are talking about is available free. If you all you want is the PDF. So please feel free to download it. It will be on the book website, and you can just download the entire PDF for nothing.
okay,
Because
cool.
I like to say it because, I'm not personally interested in, making a lot of money. I'm just really interested in getting people reading and thinking about these ideas.
That's wonderful. And I mean, no excuse there. I mean, you have it available, basically public domain, and so you can get knowledge like that. And I like to see, or I'd like to consider my forum as a public service forum where I'm not really in this to make money. I mean, sure, I want more subscribers, but I haven't collected a dime so far from this. I mean, even though I'm a monetized channel, I haven't collected any money from this. So this is almost like an educational experience outside of the brick and mortar academia, the beautiful academia, which I have so many issues with. And that's probably the reason why I
As
have
you
one
should.
foot in and out.
As you should. It's always been a problem, and it's going from bad to worse. I can tell you that.
No doubt. So you mentioned neoliberalism earlier. If we're talking about leading figureheads of neoliberalism, is it safe to say you mentioned Margaret Thatcher, people like Ronald Reagan come to mind? Are these the leading figures, or do they just go in and out like revolving doors, like Bill Clinton? Are all these people a part of this umbrella term neoliberalism?
Well, that's very interesting because, I was a graduate student. I became a graduate student in 84. So, for most of my adult life, this has been the dominant policy paradigm. And when I was younger, we used to associate neoliberalism with Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan. But in reality, what has happened since, well, in the 1980s, that seemed to be roughly quite accurate, basically. But beginning in the 1990s, what you began to witness is that the left of center parties, like the Labour Party in Britain or the Democratic Party here or the Social Democratic Party in Germany and so on, they began a slow but sure migration of their political positions. Like, think about it this way. In the 1970s, there was a huge crisis. And in the response to the crisis, the right-wing parties moved to the right. And for a time, left-wing parties did move to the left.
Mm.
So you got figures like Tony Benn, for example, and so on. So there was a certain amount in the UK. I mean, this was not everywhere, but there was a certain amount of left-wing resurgence more generally. But then over the course of the 80s, what happened is that essentially, so with the right wing having moved to the right, instead of staying on the left, essentially left-wing parties also moved to the right, often involving an enormous, practically civil war within the party itself in order to defeat the left wing and then, essentially come to bring the entire, say, the Labour Party of the UK to the right. So from leaders like Blair and Clinton and Schroeder onwards, you've had essentially a situation in which parties that should have attacked neoliberalism have accepted neoliberalism. So what you have today is a cross-party consensus on neoliberalism. And in fact, I would say that today, and this is to do with one of the later chapters in my book, I forget the number, but it's the chapter that's entitled Know Your Enemy. And it talks about pseudo-civic neoliberalism.
I think number 6 or 7, 6, I
Yeah,
think.
something like that. Anyway, so the point is that today, what has happened is that so in the 90s and 2000s, essentially, this cross-party consensus reigned. It didn't matter who was in power, whether Clinton was in power or Bush Jr. was in power, etc. You got the more or less the same policies with small differences at the edges. After 2008 in particular, however, there was actually, these policies became even more burdensome. And as a result, the number of people who were disaffected with neoliberalism began to multiply. But by this time, the left wing was no longer there to mobilize them and say, okay, we are going to give you an alternative. Let's build socialism instead, or something like that. Instead, the kind of political forces that were able to mobilize some of the discontents of neoliberalism, not all of them, were forces like Trump and Brexit. So you have this crazy situation in which today you have Trump versus Biden. What does that mean? You have essentially Biden representing an establishment neoliberalism in which neoliberal economic policy is combined with a certain tokenistic social liberalism in which you are not feminist or anti-racist, but you appoint a couple of non-white people and women in positions of power and you think you've done your job, you know. And while the condition of the overwhelming majority of women and non-white people remains exactly as it was before, if not, it gets worse. So you have that. And then you have forces even further to the right of them, like Trump, mobilizing the discontents of neoliberalism on the basis of completely false explanations of what is ailing them. What is ailing them is neoliberal economic policy. But instead, Trump says it's China, it's the immigrants, it's all these other things. And this is the kind of completely false political polarization in which we are living. I mean, it's a force emerges. I'm working, I should say, on full disclosure with Jill Stein's campaign, because I think we need a political force like that, absolutely, in the United States.
There's a lot that you said there. Actually, before I was going to ask you the question, you kind of answered it yourself, but that's the part where I have my doubts, Radhika, when it comes to I'm not convinced that Trump is to the right or left or anything of Biden. I'm not convinced of that. And I say it because it seems to be implied in your comments that you said earlier that there's a cross-consensual agreement on neoliberalism as it is between both parties. We're talking about within the United States. At what point does it even make a difference what the posturing is? It almost seems like there's a deliberate use of language to connect to certain bases within the working class in the United States, whether Trump is using anti-immigrant language or anti-China language or whatever it may be, and then Biden's using this fake tokenistic "I love Black people." I mean, at some point, like, does that even matter? Like, is it just? I think it's very confusing to people who are like, they don't find a home politically. They don't have a political home. And then you have a second problem that I see where people are convinced that Barack Obama is the most left president ever. And these are people who consider themselves lefties, thinking that this guy is like the most left president ever. There's just so many different double-edged sword problems I see between both lines of thinking.
But I mean, what that makes me think about, you're absolutely right about what you said. So first of all, let me just say one minor quibble, and then I'll elaborate on exactly what you're saying, which is so true. The quibble is simply that, you know, when you say we are not sure whether Trump is right or left, I mean, I would say that, you know, while many people say that the terms right and left have become meaningless, to me, you are right wing if your primary concern is the defense of property.
Oh, okay.
And you are left wing if your primary concern is the welfare of working people. It's work versus property. This is what it's all about. Okay. Now, and by work, I don't mean just paid work. In the working class, I include everybody who must work to make their living, whether they are paid for, whether they're employed or not, whether they are paid for it or not. So that includes, for example, the vast majority of women who do a lot of work, although many of them may not be employed, or care workers, or whatever you may want to call them. But anyway, so a lot of care work in our society is done without being paid for it, right? Whether it is the care of children, the sick, the elderly, etc. Anyway, but so to me, it does make a difference, and I would say that Biden is right wing, and Trump is in most ways even more right wing. Okay, because so that's the first thing. Secondly, Trump led the way. Forces like Trump led the way. What they started doing is essentially using any kind of rhetoric that would be necessary in order to get votes to win elections. So China, anti-immigration, etc. These are all ways of diverting attention from the real causes of the misery of the people and pointing in the wrong direction. And if you are, and I would say a lot of people, ordinary voters in America, realize completely what Trump is saying, and I have not voted for Trump. But nevertheless, enough people voted for Trump to put him in power once, and they might do so yet again. Who knows? And you have seen that Biden has not been able to give up Trump's rhetoric. He has had to sort of essentially grandfather Trump's anti-China as well as anti-immigration practices, if not the full rhetoric, into his platform, because if you are not going to point to the real culprit, which is a senile, financialized, neoliberal capitalism, then you have to point to some or the other false culprit, and China and immigrants are the false culprits, and he doesn't have anything else to point to. So he has had to continue to do the same. And so that's a second point I wanted to make. And a third point I want to make is that, of course, people are not dumb. As they say, you can fool some of the people some of the time, but not all of the people all of the time. So what has happened over the course of the new on the basis of their existing practices and rhetoric is dwindling. The ability of the Republicans and the Democrats to control the American public is declining. And that means that no party can be absolutely sure of winning elections. And this process has now come to a very acute point. It reached one inflection point when forces like Trump arose, so that the Republican Party was no longer, the sort of the Republican Party of, I don't know, George Bush Jr. It became a very different Republican Party. The Democratic Party is still more or less the same, Biden, Obama, Clinton, they are all part of the same continuum, or they are the same politicians who capitulated to neoliberalism. So the change has come from the right, fine. But whether you are right or left, and the right, by the way, is more organized, because it seems as though Trump able to rely on a good 40% of the American electorate or something like that, that are going to vote for him. And what Biden doesn't know is whether enough of the rest will vote for him, because a lot of them will say, well, you know what, pox on both your houses, I'm going to stay at home. I'm not going to vote because you don't enthuse me enough. And that's been the Democrats' problem. Democrats have, they are tokenistic about getting the black vote and everything, but what have they done for African Americans and Hispanics and all of that? So why shouldn't they stay at home? So that's why you are seeing there's a very famous political scientist. Unfortunately, he passed away rather young, but he wrote a book called Ruling the Void. These parties are sort of ruling a void. They cannot really control it, but they are trying to get some sort of purchase on it. They're trying to control it, but they are losing their capacity to do so very quickly. And I think this process will only go further unless and until a force emerges that is able to name the problem and formulate a program to go beyond it. But name the real problem, not the false problem, but yes.
We've talked about this topic a lot on the forum, and I don't have a horse in the race when we talk about neoliberals, like who's more neoliberal, who's more right, who's more left. But based on my own personal experiences talking to people, it's odd because I actually have easier conversations talking to Trump supporters about economics now than I do Biden supporters. I think there's also, it's almost like you have a group that's more all in the neoliberalism, and you have a right wing that doesn't know exactly why it's right wing besides some rhetoric points. But I feel like there's room to change those people over. I almost see the working class as like an untapped potential in the working class. So I've tried to reframe it in my mind and not see people as Trump supporters, Biden supporters. I just think people need some kind of a reset
Absolutely.
to where they can like be exposed to those ideas. But the problem is that the mainstream media is not giving them those ideas. They're all buying into this whole game of Monopoly. I mean, it's crazy. The probably the most popular board game we have, and I'm guilty of this too. I love playing Monopoly. You know, it's like Park Place and Boardwalk and everything. But it's like it's so embedded in our culture, and it's just like everything is just. I believe it's a moving target for people, and you have someone like myself that's a part of one of those visible minority groups. And it's like I've seen the bullshit of Joe Biden. Like it doesn't work on people like us. More and more black people are they don't care about Joe Biden anymore. And so the problem is that for those people, they don't see any other option. They see a difference as the other side, which will be Trump. They see anyone that's not Joe Biden as different. People like me is who are politically homeless are like, okay, both of these people are shit options. So it's like, who else is available? I think there's just so much that's stewed in this gumbo, and that's why people are confused because they're
You
like,
know,
oh, that's Kiko's a socialist. It's like Radhika's like, you know, whatever you would consider yourself. I'm not going to tag a label on you, but it's like I'm talking to a Trump supporter, and we're speaking the same language, but they have a different way of describing their experiences that I'm trying to describe to them.
well, I mean, I think that I'll just pick up on one thing that you said, which I think is quite true and important. You said that it's easier to talk to Trump supporters because they are less wedded to the neoliberal ideas, and I agree with you. Why is that? Because Trump because Trump has sought to mobilize the discontents of neoliberalism. In his electoral rhetoric, he has had to identify some of the problems with it. For example, America's deindustrializing economy.
Mm-hmm.
He's right about that. And you know, whereas the Democrats, they just think that a few more subsidies being shoveled in the direction of corporations and everything will be fine. No, nothing is going to be fine, not in this way. Because remember, what is neoliberalism? To go back to the point I was saying, neoliberalism is the commitment to defend capitalism even in its corporate form, especially in its corporate form.
Mm-hmm.
Even though in this form it has actually long been indefensible, but that is what you are doing, is you are so because Trump is challenging that, he is willing to say there's something wrong, we are deindustrializing, we have, you know, we have no jobs, we have to do something about it. But of course, when he gets to power, all of that is forgotten.
Mm-hmm.
When, as soon as Trump was elected, I even wrote a column about that. No sooner was Trump elected than all the corporate wagons started circulating around Trump, and all of them were trying to do their own little deal with them. And that's inevitably going to happen because the corporations cannot exist without the federal government giving them a lot of largesse in one form or another, whether it is friendly legislation or outright subsidies or particular tax loopholes or whatever it is that they want. But they need something or other. They cannot exist otherwise. So they have to do it, and they will do it. So in that way, both Trump and Biden are neoliberals. But
Mm-hmm.
rhetorically, Trump has to break the barriers of neoliberalism in order to get elected.
Wow, this is amazing. Um, I think this has answered the question I've had for a long time. It really has answered the question, and I think like people who identify on the left have to have these honest conversations. We can't just keep saying this person is a little bit less you know of a crappy person and this person just an all out crappy person. Like we need to really think like deeply with people that we're involved in, even if we don't share the same politics, because
Yes.
there's a game that's been played on us like big time, and it's all keeping this fake system intact. I mean, all these tactics are used to keep capitalism stronger than ever before, and we have to find some kind of a way to break this dialogue that the mainstream media and everyone else is using to keep this system going. I mean, obviously they've been successful keeping this system intact, and so whether it sounds good or whatever, you have to think what interest are these rhetorics serving? Like, who is it serving? Is it serving the working people, or is it serving somebody else?
But let me just say one other thing, because it's very important. And that's what Marx means by contradiction.
Mm-hmm.
You said just now that they've managed to keep the system intact. And of course, it's true in the sense that they have managed to keep the system, a system in which corporate power calls the shots. Absolutely. But that does not mean that it's a healthy system or it's a system that's well functioning. On the contrary, the entire system is crumbling from within. And it's like you are keeping in existence, in zombie existence, a capitalism that has kind of died a while back. So in that sense, all is not well, shall we say, in the state of Denmark. That is to say, things are not okay. Yes, you've kept the political system to be one in which, with that will do the bidding of big corporate capital. But even when you do the bidding of big corporate capital, how long can it last? Because it has to provide some minimum level of well-being to ordinary people, and that it stopped doing quite a long time ago. This became particularly clear after 2008, which is why I don't disagree with Rasmus that was a very important milestone. But nevertheless, we're now in a we're now in a stage where the decay has gone on for 15 more years.
Mm-hmm. So this is a perfect segue. Look at this. I mean, just wonderful. I love when the transitions are like that, flawless. So we talked about the deficiencies of capitalism. I mean, the pandemic highlighted that more than anything. If people didn't know, if they didn't wake up out of that coma before, when they thought about the deficiencies of the healthcare system, the lack thereof in the United States, especially, I'm sure this applies to other countries, but the U.S. was definitely exceptionally affected by the pandemic just based on the lack of preparation. There's no protocol. There was no sort of energy directed towards the people, no proper mask or anything. No one had any sort of resources. But before I get to my question I have for you and your chapter 5 especially, my particular interest in the pandemic was I had a different experience. I'm 41 years old. And so I thought about the AIDS epidemic of the 80s, even though by the time I really knew what it was, I was only 6 years old. So that would have been in 1988. But I had a few family members that succumbed to HIV and AIDS and died. And it was almost a silent pandemic back then. It's almost what the media did this time around was opposite. They enhanced everything was about COVID. They had the death ticker on the screen, and if people were alive back in the 80s, they were trying their best to not talk about AIDS because of who it was affecting: gay people in San Francisco, Black people, drug addicts, whatever group they wanted to use as some kind of a face of this new virus, which was AIDS. I saw a lot of parallels between that and the pandemic, but my skepticism was high. Like, I'll be public disclosure, I didn't get the vaccine. I didn't get the series of vaccines, the quote unquote vaccines, because I used it from a lens. I'm saying to myself, when is this country, and this may be super pessimistic, but when has this country ever done something healthcare wise that benefited the mass scale of people? And I'm saying they keep pushing these vaccines on people. And I saw it as almost like within capitalism, it's like a product. I compared it almost to like I have an iPhone 14, and it's like, what's going to be the next version? iPhone 22. It's like there's always a reboot in the system, but there's never something in place to actually solve the problem. It's just a band-aid on a band-aid on a band-aid. And that's the way I saw the response to the pandemic in the United States. Would you have any sort of rebuttal to that, or would you like to expand on anything that I've mentioned?
I mean, you make a lot of different points, and I'd like to respond to them. And feel free to come back to me if I missed any important one. So first of all, I agree with you that the current pandemic, the recent pandemic, the COVID pandemic, was connected to the AIDS pandemic in the following sense. And I discuss this in the book as well, in chapter 5. What do I mean by that? Well, basically, since the onset of neoliberalism, we have had an increasing frequency of the jumping from, the zoonotic viruses, the viruses that jump from animals to humans, which can be deadly. I mean, if a virus has been circulating among humans, then humans over time acquire some level of immunity to them, and then it's fine. It's like getting a common cold that we can't avoid them, but we don't die of them. So the really deadly ones come from the animals, where again they are circulating among animals, but the animals are used to them, etc. And by the way, at this and there's been a whole series of them since AIDS. You've had SARS, you've had Zika, you've had so many different there are various forms of avian flu, which of course have come more regularly than you only know about it really if you're a farmer, etc., etc. So, and the reason why this has happened is because essentially, neoliberalism has devastated the environment and animal habitats, etc., to such an extent, and also at the same time vastly expanded factory farming to such an extent that these steps happen now more frequently and regularly. Okay, so to me, that's one aspect of the story. The second aspect of the story is you are absolutely right in being exceedingly skeptical about the response of neoliberal governments to the pandemic. So all this, the responses that took place, essentially they, as I describe in my chapter, they were motivated not by a desire to save the lives of ordinary people, but to protect capital. Practically everything was done to protect capital, including, for example, just to give one example of the many things I talk about, in the UK and also in the US. So remember that Boris Johnson and Donald Trump were president and prime minister respectively at that time. Apparently, both governments seriously considered letting the pandemic rip through the population. Now, I'll just say one thing before continuing. You have not been vaccinated. I have been vaccinated. I had my questions about vaccines because they were rolled out so quickly and so on, but I satisfied myself that, okay, on balance, this is worth taking. And I have had my, I think, 4 or 5 shots, actually. So, and I'm fine, and I did get COVID once, and I survived. It was very mild, I think, presumably because I'm vaccinated, but who is to know? I don't know, but I'm just reporting the situation since you reported very honestly yours, so I'm reporting very honestly mine. Now, so I think that the vaccine question is a different question, but the governments essentially initially considered letting the pandemic rip. Okay, so it's going to carry off a few people. Let them take who they want. They will take the hindmost. We are going to continue because how can you shut down the economy, etc., etc. And they were only stopped from doing this by people who warned them that if you don't have some kind of measures in place, don't have some sort of shutdown, then you will have an even bigger panic because people stay home. People will be afraid. They will stay at home. They will not come to work. They will, and people will die, and the hospital systems will be overwhelmed. Remember, we are looking at hospital systems in both of these countries that had, after 40 years of neoliberalism, had been weakened to a great degree. So their capacity to react to this was already very low. And so there would be even greater panic as a result, etc., etc. So finally, they decided to have a lockdown. Not Trump, but Johnson. In the United States, what happened is different states declared their own lockdowns, depending on which government you had in power. But in the UK, which is a more sort of easy to understand case, so they did have a lockdown. And then what they should have done is they should have used the breathing space provided by a few weeks long, a couple of months long lockdown to prepare to open up safely so that you could have resumption of contact without any of the problems. And this could have been done, as I say, in a controlled fashion with mask wearing, distancing, etc., etc. But and also having hospital systems prepare for it, etc. And this was in fact not done. So they essentially had lockdowns without the preparation for lockdowns, for opening up safely. So as a consequence, they just opened up thinking, okay, somehow the virus has disappeared. And then they had repeated lockdowns. And so it was all a a spectacle of incompetence.
Mm-hmm.
And I would say that this has, and then in the course of this, what happened is that the so-called left of the political spectrum, especially after Biden's election and so on, they essentially took the position that, everybody should be vaccinated and we should have mandatory vaccines and we should have mandatory this, that, and the other, completely erasing the distinction between those who are unvaccinated and those who are anti-vaxxers. Also, given the history of vaccines, people should accept, there has been much abuse in the history of vaccines. So authorities should accept that there is going to be healthy skepticism about the vaccines. They should be willing to persuade without mandating.
Mm-hmm.
But this was not also being done. In fact, very
Mm-hmm.
often in the United States, I read that, you were supposed to be vaccinated, but you had to haul yourself miles and miles away in order to get a vaccine. And other people were told that vaccines were free, but then suddenly were faced with some great big backing bill for a vaccine, et cetera, et cetera. So when these things happen, people lose faith. And in this craziness, what then happened is that the right wing was doing all the running in terms of the criticism of government policy on COVID. And the criticism was, we don't need lockdowns. There is no such thing as COVID. It's just a mild, flu, whatever it is. Trump, of course, learned the lesson the hard way, but as did Johnson for that matter.
Mm-hmm.
But a lot of other people continued to believe that. They said, we don't want vaccine mandates. We don't want lockdowns. And many capitalists were financing these protests. Also remember that because they didn't want the economy to shut down. They wanted people to come and work, and if a few of them died, fine, there are plenty of others to hire. So that was their attitude, in my humble opinion. So the running was, the opposition came only from the right in this way that I feel was actually quite unhelpful. What was completely missing was an indictment of both of the Trump, the Biden, the Johnson, and all subsequent administrations in the UK and everywhere else, from a left-wing perspective that said that the saving of lives should have been the priority all along. And this was not the priority for our administrations, for our governments, and this is the result, et cetera, et cetera. And a final point, I do take a very strong position in favor of China, which I think had the correct policy. And in the end, China had to lift China lifted the restrictions in a very complex combination of circumstances. On the one hand, they have achieved a level of vaccinations that made them think that that was okay. Number two, Omicron was less lethal, so they felt it was okay. And finally, one country cannot keep up this policy without other countries joining, and practically no one else, apart from a few other socialist countries like Vietnam and Laos and Cuba and Venezuela and so on, were joining it. So in that sense, China could not keep it up. But in the end, and we are still to wait and see what the figures are, but in the end, I think China has still got away with relatively low death count, a fraction of the death count of the United States or the UK, etc.
With over 3 times the population.
No, sorry, when I say death count, I mean it's per million. So then you are factoring out the size of the population. So China will have a higher number of dead, may even have a higher absolute number of dead, but in terms of deaths per million,
Oh,
it's
yeah. Yeah, that's what I mean. Like a country with 3 times the amount of people as the United States, for instance, but yet they were able to relatively control it.
Exactly.
And apparently that's where the origin of the virus was. Again, and
Well,
I'm not even going to get
that's
into
another story altogether, and we are yet to find out what's going to happen. And the US government's policies have not helped in finding the truth of, because we need to know where it came from in order to prevent future such events. And there are at least there are many possibilities, including the so-called lab leak situation. But we need to know what it was. But if the US does not cooperate, how are we going to find out?
And that was and for skeptics, I don't even want somehow skeptic has become such a negative word. It's funny. The first episode we did on here with my friend Martine Hyperdy and Wilson, he was talking about, Kiko, I think you're going to have a great, successful forum, but that people are going to read your title and they're going to be automatically turned off because it says free thinking in the title, Kiko's Free Thinkers Forum. But for some reason, skeptic thinkers is all of a sudden is like a bad thing, because one of the first things I thought was, okay, you have this rampant virus going around the world, but where did it come from? Like, to me, that's a natural question to be like, okay, where did this originate from? But somehow that became a critical mass of period where it's like, okay, you can now all of a sudden ask those types of questions, but in the moment, you can't ask those types of questions. And I'm just like, to me, that this whole idea of containing information until when it's conveniently available for just mass production and mass consumption is just a weird thing to me. Why come people can't think in the moment? Why do we have to wait till the official authorities tell us when we can question things all of a sudden? And they're going to do the same thing with any issue. Right now, the big thing is the genocide occurring now in the Gaza Strip. When is the mainstream media going to finally be like, oh, that was a genocide, but like 10 years later, they decide that, oh, it's a genocide? Or even when Biden said, oh, the pandemic is over, just like, who gives these people the right to just declare when things are within their vision?
No, absolutely. I mean, I think that Biden declared it over, at a time when people were still, America's death rate was still quite high. Every week, hundreds of people were dying. So it was not over, not by the yardstick he was using before. So yeah, absolutely. It was just a political convenience. And I would say that this is one of the reasons why, and you brought up Gaza. I mean, it is so horrifying, right? And people are seeing what's happening, and at the same, and they can see it's some people say it's the first televised genocide in the world, and I have to say it's soul destroying, but it's true to accept that, because one feels that one should be able to do something about it, and one does what one can, but it's not enough to stop what's happening. So but anyway, I think that as you rightly say, the mainstream media is still not calling it what it is. And it's losing credibility. And the fact is that, quite frankly, Kiko, I remember the first alternative media websites emerging already in the late 1990s. Mid to late 1990s, you already had alternative websites. I forget the exact names, but like Global Research and Counterpunch and so on emerging, because you could no longer trust the mainstream media. So that skepticism was already there. And so today we live in a media environment where there is a clear mainstream media and an alternative media. And the alternative media is absolutely, it's my lifeline. Like it allows me to know, and vis-a-vis the pandemic itself also, when I was writing this book, and I kept up also a lot of journalistic writing about the pandemic as it was unfolding, one of my lifelines in terms of intellectually understanding what was going on, especially given that I'm not a medical doctor, I'm not a virologist, etc. Who do I go on? And the fact is that this alternative media landscape has become so dynamic. So no sooner had the pandemic hit the UK, then a number of people who were doctors and virologists, etc., became concerned that, number one, the government may not be getting the right advice, and number two, even if it got the right advice, it was not necessarily implementing this advice. So they created a group called Independent SAGE. SAGE is the name of Scientific Advisory Group on Emergencies. This is the official group that advises governments on things like pandemics and other disasters. So they called themselves Independent SAGE. So they were not attached to the government, they were independent, and every week they had amazing discussions about what had gone on the previous week, what was where was the pandemic, how was the hospital system coping, what was the government doing, what was right and wrong about it, how were the people faring, all of these questions. And to me, without that input, I would not have been able to talk confidently about the few medical aspects that I needed to touch on in order to write. Because what I wrote was the political and geopolitical economy of the pandemic, not a medical thing at all, but certain medical things have to be understood. So in that sense, I think that the alternative media and your show, things like your show, I mean, you are part of now this ecosystem in which the mainstream media has to tolerate the existence of all these other media. So the credibility of both our governments and of the mainstream media is at an epic low. I mean, nobody, I mean, who is, and the other thing that has happened as well is that there is now, we have access, thanks to the internet, to media around the world. So even if you don't like your own like even if you don't see any other non-conventional media, you can just look at what Al Jazeera is saying, or what the BBC is saying, or what the German radio is saying, or what Chinese or Indian or other Brazilian stations are saying, in order to try to make sense of the world. So in that sense, the existence of the international media via the internet also makes us able to get access to other information. So it's not surprising that the mainstream media has lost all credibility.
I have, do you have 15 more minutes? I'm just curious.
Okay, yeah.
Because there's a couple questions I have to get in for sure. You mentioned the media then, and I think your audience especially would be curious to watch this episode. I believe it's episode 86 with Vanessa Otero. Vanessa Otero is the founder of Ad Fontes Media, which is supposed to be a watchdog of media and podcasting now, all these different forms. And she was the original creator of the media bias chart. And so I asked her,
Sorry, original creator of what?
of the media bias chart.
Ah, yeah, okay.
So it categorizes thing as left or right, and then it categorizes thing based on how newsworthy it is. It rates it based on, and I pressed her a little bit because it's crazy. Leading up to the interview last year, I got into a bunch of discussions with some of her staff on Facebook about, I'm like, how do you come up with these ratings about what's reliable news and what's not reliable news? And she had a lot of the people that I follow, like RT, they were rated as like the right, more or less like on the right scale, which I really don't care much about the left right scale because I think it's a joke anyway. Because I was making the point, if you pan out the map enough, everything is in the middle, right? I mean, I was just using it almost as a joke, like what's really left and right. I mean, but I was more concerned about what's credible. And these CNN, these legacy media companies are like still to me rank way too high on this media bias chart. And then you have like RT and stuff just all over the place. I mean, like rated way lower than some of the
Yes.
credible news sources. But my curiosity was when she said there's a lot of anti-American rhetoric, but I thought based on her own like methodology, what does that have to do with anything? How do you rate quote unquote anti-American sentiment? Where does that even fall on a news readability chart or anything? This leads to my question, I guess. You touch on it some, not the anti-Chinese rhetoric component or anti-Russia or anything, whoever the United States decides is their enemy. Um, how do we combat this whole idea of this China is this huge threat? Because I see it as just a phobic statement when people say that China is just this super threat towards our well-being, the likelihood of the West. I see it as almost like this Cold War dogma because I brought this up to Carlos Garrido and Noah from the Midwestern Marx Institute. How do we reframe this for different audiences to where we don't make boogeyman China, boogeyman Russia, boogeyman this, boogeyman that?
Well, you mean how do you combat the anti-China rhetoric of the US administration?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, very simple. I think that you simply point to the facts. I mean, practically every assertion of the United States is not based on fact. They say, for example, China is stealing our technology. China is not stealing anything. China has made openly available agreements with all the companies that it works with, and it has, yes, certain this has happened, and China, so some of it, some of this technology may have been transferred that way, but historically, there is no way of preventing the transfer of technology. So it is, you might as well actually do it in the way that, by open agreement. Because, imagine that you have designed some new medicine. Who is to stop any country with a decent number of scientists from buying a few of these, taking them home, breaking them down, chemically analyzing them, and producing their own versions? There's absolutely nothing. You can't keep knowledge hoarded up. And the reason why the United States is doing this is because in their senile monopoly phase, American corporations wish to continue to benefit from things like intellectual property rights, which essentially stops the flow of information and knowledge and gives them an edge. And that's what they want to do. So, you basically tell the truth about China, and China, this is not the only way in which China has acquired technology. China has a vast scientific and defense establishment. I mean, let me give you the example that just happens to come up to topmost in my mind. The US has a military industrial complex which is subsidizes to the tune of billions of dollars every year. The whole military industrial complex costs the United States $1 trillion every year. Despite that, the United States has not produced hypersonic missiles, which both China and Russia have. They have done it on their own steam. They are not stolen from anywhere else. China has its own scientific establishment, and it is quite creative. Thank you. China is taking away jobs. No, you have authorized your corporations to outsource so much production. They are not investing in China. They are merely contracting with Chinese companies. You can easily have industrial policies that require your corporations to behave themselves and create jobs in America, but you don't do that. You've never done that. Today, the Biden administration is talking about industrial policy, but I guarantee you, all it's going to be is going to be another way of shoveling more subsidies into the trough for these big hogs that are big American corporations to eat out of, So in that sense, so basically, China is militarily aggressive. I mean, what a joke. The United States, which is naturally speaking the safest country in the world. I mean, do Americans think that Mexico is going to attack them or Canada is going to attack them? Of course they're not. It has the most secure borders in the world, but it has about 1,000 military bases around the world, most of them thousands of kilometers from anywhere, from the US borders. If you want to disabuse yourself of the notion that China is being militarily aggressive and the US is not, just Google up a map of US military bases on foreign soil and Chinese military bases on foreign soil. The difference is so great, so staggering, that you will be left wondering what people like President Biden and Secretary of State Blinken are talking about. I mean, it is so easy to debunk the anti-China nonsense. It's not funny, and a lot of people and websites do that already. So, yeah.
We basically came to the conclusion, Midwestern Marx Institute and I, that is like a new version of McCarthyism. Anyone that I was telling Carlos before Noah got off the call that you could have a neutral stance towards China and Russia, for instance, and people would still call you a pro-Putin puppet. They'll call you a pro-CCP puppet. They'll call you all these names, and they're supposed to be derogatory. Because, with the war with Ukraine and Russia, everyone's got the Ukraine flags in the background. I mean, it's just absolutely insane to me, just this rhetoric that gives you like the haunted ghost of the past. It's like this revamping of, Sputnik versus the US space race or anything like that. Any of these images that conjure up in the mind with Russia versus the US, China versus the US. It seems like it's all full circle again with just the game that's been played right now.
Well, I mean, the thing is that, what I like to say is, when you say McCarthyism, then you think of the Cold War, etc. to me, the Cold War is not some new phenomena that emerged out after the Second World War. The Cold War is a new chapter in a long history of American imperialism. And that history has not stopped. So I am not surprised that McCarthyism has resurfaced. Before McCarthyism, you had other forms of persecution of opinion and so on. So I'm not at all surprised, and I agree, by the way, that there is a new McCarthyism emerging. Anyone who speaks up and points to the problems of the US position on China or Russia or any other country, Venezuela, Cuba, you name it, will be called some kind of traitor or what have you. Well, you know what? This battle has to be engaged. People who think otherwise have to stand up and say what they think, because quite frankly, if you simply accept that, then the US today itself domestically is in such a bad position, and it is taking the world in such a bad direction, that this has to be corrected.
I have one final question before we go today. I've really enjoyed this episode 88, and I know the audience is going to be thrilled when they get this released onto their platform, which is YouTube, Kiko's Freethinkers Forum. I have a small comment, and it's more conspiratorial than anything, but I think it's interesting. I use Zoom as an interface for the interviews, and every time China is mentioned, there's always an unstable internet connection for like 5 to 10 seconds. It's actually happening right now. I just mentioned China, and it froze. You froze for like 6 seconds. In all my
And you
interviews,
froze just now as well.
as soon as you mention the C word, it becomes unstable. And I'm like, is there something to this stuff, this artificial intelligence stuff? I don't know what's going on with with these software programs and stuff, but I just think it's mighty odd that I can have flawless interviews, no internet connection problems, but as soon as we talk about China, there's always internet connection problems in the
Well,
interview.
no, I mean, I had no idea about this, and I certainly have not noted it. I've certainly used Zoom for a lot of China-related things, which are not critical of China, which have actually, pointed out the problems of US policy vis-a-vis China. But we can do an experiment. Let's both say nice things about China and see what happens. Because China is a fantastic revolutionary country. See, so far so good. It's not doing anything, I think.
I think they froze so much of us before. It's like, okay, maybe we'll let them get a couple of comments.
Couple of points in.
but my question had to do with your conclusion. We really didn't talk about it in the first episode. You seem to be pretty critical, or at least skeptical, of modern monetary theory and universal basic income, which are two things that you hear about so much. It's almost like I don't want to call them described as almost like a utopian sense between some people on the left. But I hear all this stuff about MMT. To me, MMT almost became like the cryptocurrency equivalent of the left at one point. But now it's like I hardly hear people talking about MMT. But it seemed like a strong 2-year period. I saw all these independent media channels talking about modern monetary theory, and it's like I hardly even hear people talking about it now. But you seem pretty critical, or at least skeptical, of those two concepts: modern monetary theory and universal basic income. Could you tell us what stems from that?
Well, if you want to talk about modern monetary theory, it would actually take a whole episode, so, and I'm happy to do that sometime if you like. But let me just say that MMT, my line on MMT is the following. Ages ago, George Bernard Shaw was asked to write a review. He was some friend of his, not very acquaintance of his, who kept persisting that, Mr. Shaw, please write a review of my book. So Mr. Shaw reluctantly wrote a review of his book, in which he said, in this book, there are many things that are new and many things that are true. Unfortunately, what is new is not true, and what is true is not new. And that is my line on MMT. Whatever truth that is contained in MMT, we have known for a long time. Keynes said similar things, etc. And what is new in MMT, assertions like the United States can keep spending money without any inflationary consequences, etc., etc., these are completely false. Now, if you want to dig into that further, we can talk about it. On universal basic income, I guess the best way of putting it would be that at a time, so universal basic income would be okay if we had an economy capable of producing all the things that people would buy with their universal basic income. But in fact, we don't have such an economy. So so what will happen is that the few social services and state services that people do get will be replaced by universal basic income, which will be niggardly in the first instance, and it'll probably go down over time in real terms. And plus, what will you buy with these things if you don't have an economy capable of producing what you need, whether it is food and clothing and housing or education or transport or culture or what have you? If you don't have an economy capable of producing these things, it's like getting pieces of paper. What are you going to do with it?
Mm.
So what you actually need, what working people need in the US and elsewhere in all the most neoliberal countries, is actually a society that is geared to produce and provision, to provide the things people need. We need good food, good housing, good clothing, good education, good healthcare, good transport, good cities, all of these things. And I think that we have the technology to produce these things with a fraction of the effort that it took previous generations to produce. But we don't do it. We instead have this crazy economy in which a small number of people make vast amounts of money. Some of the rest of us who are fortunate enough to be employed work too many hours for too little money, and many of the rest of us are not even employed. I mean, it is a bizarre economy, and it simply has to be replaced by a more planned economy. I don't mean by that everything has to be publicly owned, but a greater measure of planning in which there is a fair amount of room for all sorts of private enterprise, so long as it does not have the reins of state policy. We need a planned socialist economy that is going to provide, which is, by the way, very easy to do today. The difficult thing is not to organize the planned economy. The difficult thing is to dislodge the reins of power from the hands of the big corporations who hold it right now. So to me, that's the most important thing. UBI is not a solution. By the way, the other sign that UBI is not a solution is the fact that a lot of very right-wing people, including many neoliberals, support UBI because they see it as a way of getting rid of the welfare state and just hand everybody a few bucks and everything will be fine.
Now, we will conclude by saying, to my listeners especially who aren't necessarily political, I want you to test out, I want you to do some homework for me and ask a couple of questions that touch on Russia, China, and then ask questions that touch on universal basic income to some of your friends who claim to be on one side of the fence or the other, and just notate their responses and just think about what we've talked about in this discussion today. That because I think the more information we get from people, the more we kind of learn about our fellow people. There's a lot of contradiction going on, and I've tried to be consistent most of my life when it comes to politics. And my dad taught me a long time ago that you can't separate economy, politics, any of this stuff. So it becomes automatically a red flag when the same people who are they're all in when it comes to like human rights. Okay, human rights, boom. Okay, so how can we talk about human rights and discredit what's going on in Gaza right now, or discredit anything that's going on, any of the genocides that have happened in the past? You have to be consistent. We can't be inconsistent like that, because when I see stuff like that, I'm like, okay, you're saying the right things. That tells me right there, maybe your interests are domestically based and not broadly based around the world. If you're not being consistent about human rights, I mean, it's a very important thing. But that's what I mean about, hearing people's responses and just seeing like, is it adding up to what their overall politics is? And you don't even have to agree with them. They don't have to be a part of the left, right, whatever, but just see if they're being consistent in their rhetoric. The same with Trumpers. The stuff about the outsourcing. you just debunked the whole China myth about, oh gosh, China's taking all of our money, all of our jobs. But he's the same person talking about we need to bring our jobs back, which sounds great. But why are you blaming China for, that being the problem in the first place? When the U.S. corporations decided to do that on their own, what does that have to do with China? It's just pointing out the contradictions in these statements and making it make sense to people, just everyday people. But I guess I wanted to ask you, do you have any final words for my audience? I'm so glad that you decided to come on to the show. I think we covered a lot of information.
Well, I would say I hope very much that people will think about all the things that we've been discussing. I hope that this has been stimulating, and I hope very much that people will, I guess, work in their own way, I think, towards peace in the world, because given especially what's going on in Gaza today, I think that that's what we need more desperately than anything else. And I hope this will somehow be possible. Thank you.
Yes, and hopefully we can have you back down the road to talk about MMT. That's a very interesting
Sure.
topic, and also the threat of the multipolar world with all these wars going around and all these unnecessary killings of people that aren't
Yeah.
even a part of this military complex. But is there a quick way to reach you in case an audience member had a question or a comment, or would you like to
Oh,
redirect the
I'm very
listening
easy
force?
to reach. Yeah, you just Google me, Radhika Desai, Manitoba, and you'll find me. I think there's another person with my name who's a chef, so I'm not her. But you'll find me very easily, and you can just email me. Email is the best way of getting in touch.
Thank you so much, Radhika, for coming back on to this dynamic episode 88. Monday we have well, not Monday, Tuesday we have a very interesting guest, episode 89. He goes by Zach Hyden, the Mad Redneck. I have my seatbelts fastened for this interview. It's not what people think it is, I believe. It just goes to show you can't necessarily judge books by the cover. And I'm just so excited for all the guests we've had on in the past, the ones we have on now, and the ones that we will have on down the road. Take care of yourselves, beautiful people. Enjoy the rest of your day. And cheers. Thank you so much, Dr. Desai, for coming back
Thank
onto
you
the
very
show.
much, Kiko.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Bye bye.